There are moments in life that don't just break your heart. They rewrite everything you thought you knew about the people you trusted most. Imagine dedicating more than 2 decades to building a company from the ground up, missing birthdays, working through holidays, choosing the factory floor over family vacations because you believed you were protecting a legacy that would one day belong to everyone you loved. Then imagine walking into work one ordinary morning, only to discover that your own brother has already decided you no longer belong. The people you've spent your entire life protecting suddenly look at you like a stranger. Your office keys no longer work. Your company email has disappeared. Security is waiting outside the conference room. And before the day is over, you're standing in the parking lot holding a cardboard box, while employees you've mentored for years watch through the windows, afraid to even wave goodbye. For Chris Carter, that wasn't the worst part. Losing his job hurt. Losing the business his father built felt devastating. But realizing his family had been planning it for months, while sitting beside him at Sunday dinners, was something he never saw coming. Every smile, every handshake, every reassuring conversation had been part of a carefully arranged performance. They believed they had removed the only obstacle standing between them and complete control of Carter Industrial Components. What they didn't realize was that the one thing they pushed out the front door was also the one person who understood every corner of the company better than anyone else. Sometimes people become so focused on winning that they forget what made them successful in the first place. And when they finally realize their mistake, it's already too late. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We share powerful stories inspired by real-life situations that remind us how resilience, integrity, and perseverance can triumph over betrayal. Chris never imagined his life would become a cautionary tale. Growing up in the small town of Ashford, Indiana, he admired his father, Richard Carter, more than anyone else. Richard wasn't born into wealth. He spent years working as a machinist before risking everything he had to start a small manufacturing business in an old warehouse on the edge of town. During those early years, there were days when the electricity was almost shut off because money was so tight. Richard often joked that the company survived on determination more than dollars. Chris believed every word. By the time he was 12 years old, he spent weekends sweeping warehouse floors and organizing inventory. He wasn't forced to help, he wanted to. Every hour spent inside that building made him feel like he was part of something bigger than himself. His older brother, Jason, had different ambitions. Jason loved the attention that came with success. He was naturally outgoing, confident, and persuasive. Customers liked him instantly, and Richard often asked him to represent the company during community events and business conferences. Chris didn't mind. Public speaking had never interested him. He preferred solving problems, improving production, and helping employees find better ways to work. As the years passed, the brothers developed an unspoken partnership. Jason became the public face of the company, while Chris quietly became the reason everything operated smoothly behind the scenes. Employees respected Jason, but they trusted Chris. If a machine failed in the middle of the night, Chris answered the call. If an important shipment risked missing a deadline, Chris stayed until sunrise, making sure it left the loading dock. He believed leadership wasn't about having the biggest office. It was about being the first person willing to solve the hardest problems. As Carter Industrial Components expanded from a local supplier into a nationally recognized manufacturer, Chris helped modernize nearly every department. He introduced new production systems, negotiated better supplier contracts, and created training programs that dramatically reduced costly mistakes. Profits grew year after year, and industry magazines praised the company's remarkable transformation. Richard proudly accepted awards on behalf of the business, often thanking both of his sons during interviews. To the outside world, the Carter family looked inseparable. They represented the classic American success story, a father who built something extraordinary, and 2 sons preparing to carry it into the future. Few people noticed the small moments that hinted everything wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Jason had started asking more questions about ownership percentages than production targets. He became increasingly interested in board appointments, voting rights, and legal documents. Chris barely noticed. He was too busy making sure the business continued growing. Looking back, he would later realize that while he was protecting the company, someone else had quietly begun positioning himself to control it. The first sign that something had changed arrived without warning. One Monday morning, Chris walked into the executive meeting room, expecting to present a plan that would secure the company's biggest contract in its history. Instead, he found the meeting already underway without him. Jason glanced toward the door, offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes, and calmly said, "We'll fill you in later, Chris." It seemed like a small moment. A simple scheduling mistake, perhaps. Chris nodded, apologized for interrupting, and walked away. But as the conference room door closed behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened without him. It was a feeling that would only grow stronger in the weeks ahead. At first, Chris convinced himself he was overthinking everything. Successful companies changed as they grew, and executive responsibilities often shifted without much explanation. That was the story he repeated to himself every time another decision happened without his involvement. But over the next several weeks, those changes became impossible to ignore. Reports that had landed on his desk every Friday suddenly stopped arriving. Department managers who once consulted him before making major decisions now hesitated before answering even simple questions. Meetings appeared on the company calendar only after they had already ended. Every time Chris asked what was happening, Jason had a smooth answer ready. "We're just streamlining communication. The board wants to try a different approach." Dad approved the changes. None of the explanations sounded unreasonable on their own. Together, they painted a picture Chris didn't want to believe. The employees noticed it too. One afternoon, while walking through the production floor, Chris greeted Mike Henderson, a supervisor who had worked beside him for nearly 15 years. Instead of their usual conversation, Mike glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Be careful, Chris," he whispered. "People are saying your name comes up in meetings, and not in a good way." Before Chris could ask another question, Mike returned to work as if nothing had happened. The warning lingered in Chris's mind for the rest of the day. He couldn't understand why anyone would question his commitment to the company. Sales were stronger than ever. Production delays had reached record lows. Customer satisfaction had never been higher. If the business was thriving, why did it suddenly feel as though someone was trying to convince everyone that he had become a problem? That evening, Chris stayed late to finish reviewing a proposal for expanding one of the company's facilities. As he walked past the executive conference room, he noticed the lights were still on. Through the narrow opening in the door, he saw Jason sitting with two board members and the company's outside attorney. Richard wasn't there. Chris wasn't there either. The discussion stopped the moment someone noticed him in the hallway. Jason stood, walked to the door, and closed it without saying a word. Chris stared at the polished wood for a few seconds, before quietly walking back to his office. It wasn't anger he felt. It was confusion. His father had always taught him that important decisions should never be hidden from family. Yet more and more, the company Richard built on trust seemed to be operating on secrets. When Chris arrived home that night, his wife Laura immediately noticed something was wrong. She had watched him pour his heart into the family business for more than 20 years. She knew the difference between ordinary stress and the kind of silence that comes from carrying a burden too heavy to explain. As they sat together on the back porch, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "If your last name wasn't Carter, do you think they'd still treat you this way?" Chris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the yard, remembering all the sacrifices that had brought him to this point. Every promotion he had declined somewhere else. Every weekend spent solving problems at the factory instead of watching his children play sports. Every decision he made believing he was protecting a legacy that would one day unite the family. Finally, he spoke so quietly, Laura almost didn't hear him. "I don't know anymore." 3 days later, the phone call came. It wasn't from Richard. It wasn't from Jason. It came from the chairman's assistant, who politely informed Chris that the board had scheduled an emergency executive meeting for 8 o'clock the following morning, and that his attendance was required. No agenda was provided. No explanation was offered. Chris barely slept that night. Deep down, he sensed that whatever awaited him in that conference room would change everything. He simply had no idea that by the end of the next morning, he would no longer have a job, and the family who had taken everything from him would unknowingly begin destroying themselves. Chris arrived at the office 45 minutes early, hoping to speak with his father before the meeting began. Richard's car was already parked outside, but the blinds in his office were closed. After knocking twice without an answer, Chris headed toward the executive conference room. 2 security officers stood quietly near the entrance. They weren't stopping anyone, but their presence felt strangely out of place. Chris offered a polite smile as he walked past them, though neither man smiled back. Inside the room, Every seat around the long walnut table was occupied except one. Jason sat confidently beside Richard, while the company's attorney arranged several thick folders in front of each board member. The atmosphere felt unusually cold. No casual conversation, no coffee cups, no laughter, just silence. Richard finally cleared his throat. "Chris, thank you for coming." His voice lacked the confidence Chris had heard his entire life. Before Chris could respond, Jason slid a folder across the table. "Over the past several months," he began, "the board has reviewed several operational decisions that have exposed the company to unnecessary financial risk." Chris frowned as he opened the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, internal emails, and reports highlighting production delays, cost overruns, and supplier disputes. At first glance, the documents appeared convincing, but as Chris read further, something didn't make sense. Several emails had been edited. Dates didn't match. Decisions that had been approved by multiple executives were suddenly presented as if Chris had acted alone. He looked toward his father, expecting him to question the inconsistencies, but Richard remained silent, staring down at the table. "This can't be right," Chris said calmly. "These reports leave out half the story. The board approved these projects. You all did." Jason leaned forward without raising his voice. "The board believes your leadership has become a liability. We need stability if this company is going to continue growing." The words hung in the room like a final verdict. One by one, board members avoided Chris's eyes. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply looked away. Then came the vote. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Every hand except Richard's went up in favor of removing Chris from his executive position. Richard hesitated, his hand trembling slightly before he slowly lifted it as well. In that single moment, 23 years of loyalty disappeared. The attorney calmly explained the separation agreement waiting inside the folder. Chris barely heard a word. His attention remained fixed on his father, hoping Richard would finally speak, finally say there had been a mistake. Instead, Richard whispered only 4 words. "I'm sorry, son." Those words hurt more than losing the company itself. Security approached respectfully and informed Chris they would escort him to collect his personal belongings. News spread through the building faster than anyone expected. Employees stopped working as Chris carried a small cardboard box through the hallway. Some lowered their heads, others quietly shook theirs in disbelief. Mike Henderson stepped forward as if he wanted to say something, but another manager gently pulled him back. No one wanted to risk their own job. Chris understood. He nodded once to the people he had worked beside for decades, before walking out the front doors for what he believed would be the last time. Standing alone in the parking lot, Chris looked back at the building where he had spent most of his adult life. The sign bearing the Carter family name reflected in the morning sunlight. For years, he had believed that sign represented hard work, loyalty, and trust. Now it represented something entirely different. As he placed the cardboard box into the trunk of his car, his phone vibrated. The message came from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. "Don't leave town. They lied to everyone, and I can prove it." Chris stared at the screen for several seconds. Whoever had sent the message clearly knew what had just happened. More importantly, they seemed to know why. At that moment, Chris believed he had reached the lowest point of his life. He had no idea that the story was only beginning, and that the evidence hidden inside one anonymous email would soon turn his family's greatest victory into their biggest nightmare. Chris drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before pulling into a quiet park on the edge of town. He sat in his car staring at the message on his phone, reading it over and over. Part of him wanted to ignore it. After everything that had happened that morning, he didn't have the energy for another disappointment. Yet something about the words felt different. Whoever had sent the message knew he had been fired before the news had reached anyone outside the company. They also sounded certain that what happened inside the boardroom had been carefully planned. After several minutes of hesitation, Chris replied with only 3 words. "Who is this?" The response appeared almost immediately. "Someone who watched them set you up. Meet me tonight. Come alone." At exactly 7 o'clock that evening, Chris pulled into the parking lot of a small diner nearly 30 miles from Ashford. The place was quiet, with only a handful of customers finishing dinner. Sitting in the corner booth was Daniel Brooks, Carter Industrial Components' former chief financial officer. Daniel had retired almost a year earlier, after more than 25 years with the company. Chris had always respected him. He was known for being honest, careful, and almost impossible to pressure into signing anything he didn't fully understand. Daniel looked older than Chris remembered. but the concern on his face was unmistakable. As Chris sat down, Daniel slid a thick envelope across the table without saying a word. "I hoped I'd never have to give this to you," he said quietly. "But after today, you deserve to know the truth." Inside the envelope were copies of financial records, board meeting minutes, and email exchanges stretching back almost 18 months. Chris flipped through the documents, confused by what he was seeing. Several board resolutions carried approval dates that didn't match the company's official records. Expense reports had been altered after meetings had already taken place. Most alarming of all, signatures appeared on documents Richard had supposedly approved while he was recovering from surgery at home. Daniel pointed to one page after another, explaining how he had first noticed small inconsistencies that gradually became impossible to ignore. Whenever he questioned them, Jason insisted they were simple administrative corrections. Melissa often dismissed his concerns by saying the lawyers had already reviewed everything. Daniel wasn't convinced. Instead of confronting them directly, he quietly made copies of every document that seemed unusual before retiring. "I kept hoping Richard would see what was happening," Daniel admitted. "But he trusted the wrong people." Chris leaned back in his chair, struggling to process everything he had just learned. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. Daniel sighed heavily before answering. "Because I didn't have enough proof. Suspicion isn't enough to destroy a family. Facts are." He explained that after Chris was pushed out, several longtime employees contacted him privately, worried that the company was changing in ways they no longer recognized. Purchasing managers were suddenly being ordered to work with unfamiliar suppliers charging significantly higher prices. Contracts were being approved without competitive bids. Money was moving faster than anyone could explain. None of it made sense for a company that had always prided itself on careful financial management. Daniel believed someone was using Carter Industrial Components to enrich themselves while blaming operational problems on Chris. If that continued, the company Richard had spent his life building wouldn't simply struggle. It could collapse. For the first time since leaving the company, Chris felt something replacing the heartbreak that had consumed him all day. It wasn't anger. It was determination. He had no interest in revenge. He wasn't trying to reclaim his old office or embarrass his brother. But if someone was stealing from the business his father had built through decades of sacrifice, he couldn't walk away. Daniel reached into his briefcase one last time and placed a small flash drive on the table. "Everything I copied is on here," he said. "Emails, financial records, meeting notes, all of it. If you decide to fight this, don't do it emotionally. Do it the right way. Let the evidence speak for itself." Chris picked up the flash drive and slipped it into his jacket pocket. As he stood to leave, Daniel offered one final warning. If Jason was willing to remove his own brother to protect whatever he's hiding, don't underestimate how far he'll go once he realizes you're asking questions. Chris nodded quietly before walking out into the cool evening air. He had entered the diner believing his career was over. He left carrying something far more valuable than a job. He was carrying the first pieces of a truth that had the power to bring an entire empire crashing down. Chris followed Daniel's advice with one rule in mind: no emotional decisions. He hired an independent attorney and a respected forensic accountant, handing over the flash drive without making a single accusation. For weeks, he heard almost nothing. The investigators requested additional records, interviewed former employees, and quietly compared internal documents with public filings. Then the phone call finally came. The evidence was stronger than anyone had expected. Company funds had been redirected through inflated supplier contracts linked to businesses secretly controlled by Jason's associates. Several board resolutions had been altered after meetings had ended, and signatures had been copied onto documents Richard had never personally approved. The investigation was immediately turned over to the appropriate authorities. Chris didn't celebrate. He simply sat in silence, realizing the company he had spent most of his life protecting had been betrayed from within. The fallout came quickly. News of the investigation spread through the business community, and Carter Industrial Components began losing major customers almost overnight. Banks froze important lines of credit until the financial review was complete. Board members who had voted to remove Chris suddenly claimed they had been misled by incomplete information. Jason, once so confident in every board meeting, struggled to explain the growing list of irregularities. Melissa insisted everything had been approved legally, but the documents told a different story. Employees who had remained silent for months finally stepped forward, sharing emails, meeting notes, and conversations that painted the same picture. Piece by piece, The truth became impossible to deny. Richard watched the company he had built over 4 decades begin to crumble, not because of Chris, but because he had trusted the wrong son. Several months later, Richard asked Chris to meet him at the original warehouse where Carter Industrial Components had first begun. The building had long since been emptied, but the old workbench Richard once used was still there. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Richard looked at his son with tears in his eyes. "I failed you," he said quietly. "I was so afraid of losing the company that I never realized I was losing my family." Chris could see the regret written across his father's face. It would have been easy to answer with anger after everything that had happened. Instead, he simply replied, "Dad, the company was never the most valuable thing we had. Trust was. And once that's gone, money can't buy it back." Chris never returned to Carter Industrial Components. Instead, several former employees reached out, asking if they could work with him again. Customers who had trusted his leadership offered their support, and investors impressed by his integrity agreed to back a new venture. It didn't happen overnight, but within a few years, Chris built a manufacturing company, founded on the principles he had always believed in: transparency, accountability, and respect for the people doing the work. Many of the same employees who had once watched him leave with a cardboard box now proudly walked through the doors of his new headquarters. They hadn't followed a company name, they had followed a leader they trusted. As for Jason, the career he had spent years protecting disappeared almost as quickly as it had risen. Legal consequences, damaged relationships, and a shattered reputation followed him long after the investigation ended. Richard eventually retired from business altogether, choosing a quiet life away from boardrooms and headlines. Although his relationship with Chris slowly began to heal, both men understood that some chapters of life can never be rewritten. If this story leaves us with one lesson, it's this: success built on deception rarely lasts, but integrity has a way of opening doors no one can close. Chris lost his title, his office, and the company he believed would be his future. What he gained was something far greater: a second chance to build a legacy that no one could take away. Sometimes the greatest setback of your life is only the beginning of your greatest comeback. And sometimes, the people who believe they've defeated you are simply giving you the freedom to become everything they never imagined you could be. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments what you would have done if you were in Chris's position. Would you have fought to get the family business back, or would you have chosen to build something entirely new? And if you enjoy inspiring stories of resilience, justice, and unforgettable karma, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story.